A myth forged from 70-2,000 tons of steel, 9 18-inch guns, and a main armor belt 410 millimeters thick. The most powerful warship ever built by human hands, an indestructible machine of war. Yet, on October 20-4th, 1940-4, after 9 full hours of relentless aerial assault, this steel Leviathan, along with 1,020-3 of her crew, sank forever into the icy depths of the Sibuyan Sea. She never hit an enemy ship. She never came within range of her terrifying main guns. She was built to fight a war that no longer existed. This was not a duel between warships. This was the most brutal judgment the aircraft carrier era passed upon the doctrine of big guns and massive armor. That morning, when 3 American reconnaissance aircraft appeared on the northern horizon, air raid sirens tore through the fleet's silence. Musashi, 7 hours from Lake Gulf, turned her guns skyward and continued south. 6 waves of attacks descended one after another, from the Intrepid, the Essex, the Franklin, the Enterprise, and the Lexington. The first torpedoes barely left a mark on her hull. She pressed forward at 20 knots with defiant pride. By the third wave, she had dropped to 10 knots, her bow 20-6 feet lower, curve or coastal deck awash. Crewmen carried rice, timber, and supplies from the hold to the starboard side to counter the list. The port anchor was dropped into the sea. The forward gun turret was evacuated and its magazine flooded to prevent explosion. She was still firing back. But the Musashi's death did not begin on the morning of October 20-4th. Her death began the day Japan built the most powerful battleship in history to fight a war that carrier aircraft had already made obsolete. Could a battleship be built that carrier aviation could not sink? The answer arrived at 1930-6 on October 20-4th, 1940-4. To understand the fate of the Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea, one must understand the theory that built her. What that theory got right, and the specific way it had already been proven wrong before she was ever attacked. The construction of the Musashi at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki was one of the most closely guarded industrial secrets of the 20th century. Japan understood that building the largest warship in history would provoke a response from the United States Navy, and that response might come before the ship was finished. The solution was total concealment. A hemp screen 70-5,000 square meters in area was erected around the construction area to block the ship from view. The screen was so massive it could be seen from the hills above Nagasaki, but what lay behind it remained unknown. Workers were photographed and their identities documented. Secret police swept the area of foreign employees before construction began. Every blueprint was tracked. Every worker with access to the specifications signed a secrecy oath. In 1930-8, a blueprint went missing. The investigation that followed included the torture of suspects. A draftsman who had accidentally swept an document into a trash bin was identified, charged, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The document was recovered that same May. 6 Soviet Tupolev TB-3 bombers, flying with Chinese markings, overflew southern Japan on a propaganda mission and photographed Nagasaki from the air. One of their photographs showed an enormous hull under construction in the number to slipway at Mitsubishi. The photograph reached American intelligence. The analysts who reviewed it did not identify what they were looking at. The largest battleship ever built was photographed from the air before the war and went unrecognized. She was launched on November 1, 1940. The ceremony was attended only by senior naval officials. As soon as she entered the water, the cargo ship Kasugameru was positioned alongside to shield her hull from observers. She was named Musashi after the ancient Japanese province whose territory today includes the city of Tokyo. Naval warfare in the first decades of the 20th century operated on an assumption that battleships were the decisive weapon of naval combat. The reasoning was straightforward. A battleship powerful enough carried enough armor to resist the shells of any opponent and enough guns to destroy any ship it encountered. If the armor was thick enough and the guns were large enough, the ship was effectively invincible in a surface engagement. The answer to a battleship was a bigger battleship. The Musashi and her sister ship, the Yamato, were the most complete expression of this theory ever constructed. Built in secrecy at Nagasaki, the Musashi was commissioned in August 1940-2, the same month that American and Japanese forces began the 6-month campaign for Guadalcanal. She was 860-2 feet long. Her belt armor was 410 millimeters thick. Her 9 main guns fired shells weighing 1,400 kilograms at targets 40 kilometers away. She had been designed to survive what she could absorb, and no ship in the world had been designed to hit what she could hit. The theory was correct in the narrow sense in which it was stated. No surface ship could sink her in a gun engagement. The armor belt defeated the largest shells any opponent could fire. The guns outranged anything afloat. In the war, she was designed to fight against the surface fleets that had existed when her designers drew her plans. She was everything her specifications promised. The problem was that the war she was built for had ended before she entered service. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1920-2 had placed limits on the tonnage and armament of battleships built by the major naval powers. Japan had signed the treaty and had been constrained by it. When Japan withdrew from the treaty system in 1930-4 and began planning the Yamato class, the reasoning was specific. America's industrial capacity meant America could always build more battleships than Japan in a conventional arms race. The answer was not to build more ships. The answer was to build ships that could defeat several American battleships simultaneously. The logic was internally consistent. A single Musashi with her 18-inch guns and her 410mm belt armor could in theory outfight 2 or 3 conventional battleships at once. If Japan could not match American battleship numbers, it could make each of its ships count for more. The program consumed enormous resources, required extraordinary industrial effort, and produced the 2 most powerful surface combatants in history. The architects of the program understood something about battleships. They had not fully absorbed what their own Navy demonstrated at Taranto and off Malaya. On November 11th and 12th, 1940-1, less than a month before Pearl Harbor, British carrier aircraft from HMS Illustrious attacked the Italian fleet at anchor in Taranto Harbor and sank 3 battleships with torpedoes. The attack took 20 minutes and cost the British to aircraft. In a single night, a theory about the relationship between battleships and carrier aircraft was answered definitively. Carrier aviation could sink battleships at anchor. On December 10th, 1940-1, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese land-based aircraft attacked the British force Z off the coast of Malaya. The Prince of Wales and the Repulse, 2 of the most powerful ships in the Royal Navy, were sunk into hours. They were at sea, not at anchor. They were maneuvering. They had experienced crews. They had no air cover. The principle established at Taranto was confirmed. Carrier aircraft could sink battleships at sea under combat conditions. Japan knew this. The Japanese Navy had conducted the very operation that proved it. Yet the designers and commanders who built the Musashi and the Yamato, while understanding that carrier aviation had changed the nature of naval warfare, still built the 2 largest battleships in history. Because the program was already underway, because the resources had already been committed, and because the theory of the decisive battleship had been built into Japanese naval doctrine so thoroughly that abandoning it was institutionally impossible. The Musashi was commissioned into a navy that had just demonstrated at Pearl Harbor and off Malaya that the ships she was designed to fight no longer determined the outcome of naval battles. She entered service as a relic of a theory the Japanese Navy itself had disproved in the first week of the war. In August and September 1940-2, the Musashi underwent crew training exercises in the inland sea. During joint gunnery drills, the Musashi's battery was fired for the first time under combat conditions. Vibrations from the 9 18-inch guns firing simultaneously were so powerful they damaged the radar display and the fire control system. Adjustments were required. The most powerful guns ever fitted to a ship shook her own systems when she used them. She was first used as a command platform. Admiral Yamamoto commanded the Japanese fleet during the Battle of Midway from the Musashi's bridge, 250 miles behind the Kido, but AI that was attacking Midway Island. She was not in the battle. She fired no shots. She watched from a distance the battle that destroyed the carriers that her anti-minus aircraft guns were designed to protect against. After Midway, she became Yamamoto's flagship throughout the subsequent operations in the South Pacific. In April 1940-3, after Yamamoto was killed in Operation Vengeance over Bougainville, his cremated remains were placed aboard the Musashi and transported from truck to Japan. She carried the ashes of the admiral who had built the navy she served back to the country he had tried to warn about the war. In March 1940-4, before she ever faced a combat air attack, the Musashi was torpedoed for the first time. The submarine USS Uni found her in the Western Pacific and put torpedoes into her hull. She took significant damage, returned to Japan for repairs, and came back with her anti-minus aircraft batteries substantially increased. The designers who had built her as a surface combatant spent the repair period adding weapons designed to fight aircraft. The acknowledgement of what the war had become was written into the modifications. She was back in service by June 1940-, for in time for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Japan's last organized carrier aviation was destroyed by American fighters in what American pilots called the Great Turkey Shoot. By June 19th, the naval air arm that was supposed to protect battleships like the Musashi from carrier air attack no longer existed. The Musashi emerged from the Philippine Sea battle intact, but her air cover was gone. In October 1940-4, the American invasion of the Philippines forced Japan to commit its remaining naval power to a final operation. The plan was called Show-Go, the Victory Operation. For separate Japanese forces would converge on Lake Gulf from different directions and destroy the American invasion fleet before the landings could be consolidated. It was the largest naval operation in history, involving nearly every ship Japan still possessed, and it had no realistic chance of achieving its objectives. Its architects knew this. The component most relevant to the Musashi was Vice Admiral Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface force Japan could still assemble. The Musashi, the Yamato, 3 other battleships, 12 cruisers, and 15 destroyers would depart from Brunei, cross the Sibuyan Sea, and pass through the San Bernardino Strait. The mission required crossing the Sibuyan Sea in daylight without air cover, within range of American carrier aircraft. The strategic situation Show-Go was designed to address was one Japan's commanders understood was already lost. American forces landing in the Philippines would cut Japan's supply line to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Without that oil, the Japanese military could not function. Show-Go was not a plan to win the war. It was a plan to postpone its conclusion at the cost of the remaining Japanese fleet. Kurita knew this. His orders were to break through to Lake Gulf and destroy the American transport fleet. The plan required his force to cross the Sibuyan Sea in daylight within range of 4 American carrier task groups, which together operated approximately 1,000 aircraft. The plan offered no solution to this problem because there was no solution. Japan had no carrier aviation remaining after the Philippine Sea in June. On October 20-3, 1940-4, before Kurita's force had even reached the Sibuyan Sea, the American submarines USS Darter and USS Dace found the force in the Palawan Passage. They put torpedoes into 3 heavy cruisers. Kurita's flagship, the Atago, sank so rapidly that Kurita was forced to swim for his life in the South China Sea at dawn. 350-9 of the Atago's crew died. Kurita was in the water for over an hour before a destroyer reached him. He was transferred by small boat to the Yamato, which became the new flagship. The Maya was sunk. The Takao was so badly damaged she had to withdraw. The force that had left Brunei to attack Leyte Gulf arrived at the sea smaller than it had departed, its commander having swum to a rescue vessel that morning. They pressed south anyway. The first American aircraft arrived over Kurita's fleet at approximately 10:30 in the morning of October 20-4th. They came from the carrier USS Intrepid, held Ivers and Avengers, and they concentrated on the Musashi because the Musashi was the largest target available. The first torpedo struck her hull and she barely registered it. At 20 knots, 410 millimeters of belt armor, 70-2,000 tons of displacement, the initial strikes were absorbed by a ship designed specifically to absorb them. The pilots who released the first torpedoes saw them run true against her hull and watched her continue south at operational speed. As the aircraft approached, combat fighters flew ahead of the held Ivers and Avengers at low altitude. Their guns aimed at the anti-minus aircraft crews on the Musashi's decks. The tactic was designed to suppress the gunners while the bombers and torpedo planes made their runs. The men operating the 20-5mm anti-minus aircraft guns had to choose between taking cover or continuing to fire. Some stayed at their weapons. She fired back with everything she had. The 9 main guns of the Musashi, 18-inch weapons capable of hurling shells 40-2 kilometers, were elevated as high as they would go and fired against aircraft flying at low altitude. The forward turret could not depress enough to engage close aircraft, so the crew fired the main battery to create columns of water in the paths of the incoming torpedo planes. 9 salvos from the largest naval guns ever fitted to a ship were fired against aircraft that weighed 2 tons each. The first wave departed. The Musashi continued south. The second wave arrived around noon. This one was different. The previous torpedoes had tested her capacity to absorb and continue. This wave found the limits of that capacity. She slowed from 20 knots to 10. She developed a 5-degree list to port. Her bow went 13 feet lower in the water. From the other ships in Kurita's formation, sailors watching from their own decks could see that she was wounded, that she was low by the bow, that she was no longer in formation but falling behind. The damage control crews worked against flooding that the pumps could not outpace. The flooding was working faster than any designed countermeasure because nothing in the design assumptions had fully anticipated what 20-1 torpedo hits felt like. Kurita ordered a cruiser and 2 destroyers to escort the Musashi separately. The main fleet continued south. Musashi began heading north at whatever speed she could still make, trying to get to shallow water where she might be beached if necessary. Her speed was not enough to outrun what was coming. The third wave arrived at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. Aircraft from the Enterprise, the Franklin, the Intrepid, and the Cabot, 11 bombs and 8 more torpedoes. In the hour and a half that followed, a badly wounded ship in distress became a ship that was visibly, irreversibly dying. The list to port reached levels where crew members on the port side were working on decks that were tilting beneath them. The forecastle was awash. The damage control teams had by this point run out of options within the ship's systems. The flooding could not be stopped by any measure the pumps and counter-minus flooding procedures could provide. What happened next was remarkable for what it revealed about the crew of a ship that was being destroyed. The damage control officer ordered every movable weight in the ship transferred to the starboard side. Sailors carried bags of rice from the ship's food stores to the starboard deck. They moved timber and supplies from every compartment they could access. They were trying to correct the list of a 70-2,000-ton ship by moving rice. It helped slightly, not enough. The port anchor, weighing tons, was released from its chain and dropped into the sea. The anchor of the Musashi, the largest battleship anchor ever built, was dropped into the sea by NC as ballast. It helped slightly, not enough. The forward gun turret, which had been evacuated earlier, had its magazine flooded to prevent the ammunition from cooking off in a fire or explosion. The turret that contained 3 of her 18-inch guns was deliberately disabled to prevent a catastrophic explosion from ending the fight prematurely. The 4th, 5th, and 6th waves arrived through the afternoon. Each found a ship that was slower, lower in the water, and more difficult for her anti-minus aircraft battery to defend. The anti-minus aircraft crews stayed at their weapons. The Musashi fired 217 rounds of 120-7 mm ammunition against aircraft through the afternoon. The Americans lost 18 aircraft over the entire fleet in the Sea. Some of those 18 were lost to the Musashi's guns. I hailed a rear gunner named Russ Dustin, flying from the USS Franklin, looked down at the Musashi from his aircraft during one of the attack waves and filed this account afterward. The Musashi was huge. He had never seen anything as big in his entire life. It was a magnificent sight. The 5th wave arrived from the Enterprise and the Franklin, 60-9 aircraft, and put for bomb hits in 3 more torpedoes into a ship that was already dead in the water. The pilots reported she was stopped, heavily down by the bow, smoking. They filed their reports and turned south toward their carriers, but she was not dead. After the 5th wave departed, the Musashi's damage control crews accomplished something that should not have been possible. They got the engines moving again. She increased speed to 16 knots. She corrected the starboard list. She was heading north toward shallow water where Rear Admiral Inoguchi still hoped to beach her. Then the 6th wave arrived. 70-5 aircraft from the Intrepid, the Franklin, and the Cabot. 30-7 of them came for the Musashi. At 16:20-1, Kurita brought the remaining fleet back to check on the Musashi. From the bridge of the Yamato, what he saw was a ship that had absorbed more combat damage than any vessel in the history of naval warfare. He could not save her. He continued south. The engine room began flooding in the late afternoon. As water reached the boilers and turbines, the speed dropped further, then stopped. At some point in the final hours, Rear Admiral Inoguchi ordered the free hands and the wounded assembled on the topside starboard to use their weight as a last countermeasure against the list. 2,000 men moved to one side of a dying ship. At 19:15, when the list reached 12 degrees and the forecastle was fully underwater, Inoguchi ordered preparations to abandon ship. The battle flag was taken down and removed. The official portrait of Emperor Hirohito, which was carried aboard all Imperial Japanese Navy warships, was also removed. Admiral Inoguchi called for his executive officer, Captain Kaito. He handed Kaito his personal notebook. He directed Kaito to abandon ship. Kaito survived. Before she went down, Rear Admiral Inoguchi attempted to run her aground on an island visible to the north. The engines had stopped. He could not steer her. He went to his cabin. He was never seen again. He was promoted to Vice Admiral posthumously. The gunnery officer, Captain Koshinoki Mitake, refused to be rescued when the destroyers came alongside. He was listed as missing in action. The destroyers Kyoshi, Mo, and Hamakase rescued 1,370-6 men. 1,020-3 did not come home. The survivors who reached Japan were not celebrated. The loss of the Musashi was a fact the Imperial Japanese Navy handled with the same secrecy it had applied to her construction. To prevent the shame of her sinking from reaching the public, the survivors were transferred to a remote island in the Seto Inland Sea, kept away from families and civilian populations. The Navy that had built a 70-5,000 square meter hemp screen to conceal the Musashi's construction now used a remote island to conceal the fact that she was gone. The paradox of the Musashi is what those 9 hours produced and what they did not. She was built to fight surface ships. Her 18-inch guns were designed to fire at enemy battleships and cruisers at distances of 20 to 40 kilometers. The Musashi never came within 40 kilometers of an American warship. She never fired her main guns at the target they were built for. She was designed to be the most powerful ship in a surface battle and died in a kind of battle that her designers had understood was becoming decisive when they drew her plans. The four factors that determined what happened to the Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea were, each in place before she sailed from Brunei. The first was the absence of air cover. The second was target priority. American pilots directed successive waves against her specifically because she was the ship most worth sinking. Being the most powerful ship in the world made the Musashi the most concentrated target in the world. The third was torpedo geometry. Torpedoes ran below the armor belt and detonated against the hull below the waterline, where the structural design assumed water rather than high explosive. The fourth was scale. 70-2,000 tons of displacement meant that flooding the Musashi required more water than flooding a conventional battleship. It also meant that when the flooding became irreversible, the momentum of that much water was overwhelming. On March 1, 2015, Paul Allen's research vessel found the wreck at approximately 1,000 meters depth. The bow was still intact, the chrysanthemum crest still visible on the bow plating. This history deserves to be remembered, and the 1,020-3 lives that vanished in the icy waters of the Sibuyan Sea deserve to be known. If you want more in-depth analysis of the most shocking moments in World War II history, please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.